Hello and welcome. Today we're going to cover prenatal development and birth. Since we are in a psychology class, if you look over here in the left, this is kind of how our brain evolves. The original brain that began millions and millions of years ago begins with what regulates our heartbeat and basic bodily functions, including the hindbrain and the midbrain. And this is what starts first, this neural tube forming the spinal cord that, operates the basic functions. As our species evolved, we started developing in the middle of our brain something called the limbic system, which regulates many complex emotions and hormones and things along those lines. As we evolved even further in life, we ended up with this brain that looks like this, with all of these folds that is capable of storing a lot more information, higher processing powers, etc. And that's exactly how the brain grows over time. Again, it begins in here, and then you start to form out from the middle, and then right before you're born, you ended up with this highly folded brain. Okay. So then, as we'll talk about here in a second, those last few months, those last 3 months are when most of these higher level brain functions start to happen as more and more cells, more and more brain cells are created over time. And you can say this is what separates us out from others, our ability to have this fully evolved, folded brain capable of tons of processing with a bunch of cells to do our work. Okay. And again, that's what we really mostly care about in psychology. But for this, we'll just do a basic overview of some of the biological processes and psychological processes that develop over time from conception until birth. And then we'll talk a little bit about postpartum depression just to knock it out. Okay. But we're going to study these three phases. We're going to look at the germinal period, which is the first 2 weeks. Then we're going to look at the embryonic period, which is weeks 3 to 8. And we're also going to look at the fetal period, which is weeks 9 until birth. Again, this is not the only way to structure this. We could do it by first trimester, 0 to 3 months, second trimester, 3 to 6, and then, third trimester, 7 to 9. Sorry, I think it was 4 to 6. But the book is going to break it down like this, so that's what we're going to focus on. Okay. So just to break out some of these things, we need some timing and we need some terminology just to kind of have an understanding of what we're going to talk about. So again, the germinal period, that is the first 2 weeks. And this is where 65% of zygotes tend to not grow or implant properly. So right off the rip, we lose 65% of the potential babies. Then there's the embryonic period. Again, we're looking at weeks 3 to 8. And here we lose about 1/5 of the babies. And then the fetal period after weeks 8, that's when you start to get on more solid ground. You tend to lose about 5% of the babies. But as you can see, only about 27% of all zygotes, once it's implanted and ready to rock, make it to fruition. Okay. So the beginning of pregnancy, we often call the gestational age. This is, conception to about 2 weeks. Okay. The full length of pregnancy, there's two ways to measure it. You can do it as 38 weeks or 9 months, or you can look at it as 40 weeks or 10 lunar months. And then again, we can break it down in a trimester. So instead of germinal period, embryonic, and fetal, we could do first, second, and third trimester. And then, yes, we always have a predicted due date, but only about 5% of babies are born on that due date. But a full term baby is considered full term if it's born 2 weeks before or 1 week after that. Okay, so the very first stage, the germinal stage. This one-celled zygote becomes a multi-celled blastocyst, which duplicates, divides, and differentiates. Again, very complex. Okay, I don't understand all the biology and I don't understand words. But here is when the egg is implanting itself into the uterus, okay? And this takes about 2 weeks, okay? All right. And that's what that is. And so, all right. So the zygote happens. Then we get into the embryo. So again, the first 2 weeks, the zygote implants itself. 65% of that do not make it to the embryo stage. Okay, but it is here in the zygote that, everything starts to divide and the baby starts to be, a baby, as you could say. All right. And so once the implantation begins, as the shell burrows into the nurturing lining of the uterus. Again, this is just quoted from your book because that's the easiest way to describe it. Then we can go on to the next phase, the embryo phase, which is usually from 3 to 8 weeks. Okay. So the third week initiates the embryonic period during which the mass of inner cells takes shape, not recognizably human, but worthy of the name embryo. Okay. Now, and again, about 1 in 5 pregnancies end, but if all goes well, then the head with eyes, ears, nose, and the mouth start to form during this period. Okay. Then about the fifth week, the buds that form the arms and the legs emerge, and a minuscule blood vessel that will become the heart begins to pulsate. So again, that beating heart by week 8, and then the basic body shape starts to form. Upper arms and forearms, palms and webbed fingers grow in week 6, legs, knees, and webbed toes. In that order will appear a few days later, each with the beginning of a skeleton. Then 52 to 54 days after conception, the fingers and toes separate. And then by 8 weeks past conception, the embryo has organs and body parts of a human. Okay. And so pretty much by week 8, it's on. Also, interestingly, during this period, the embryo has both male and female potential. It isn't defined until a little bit later when you get this surge of hormones and then it kicks the gonads, to become ovaries or testes. Okay. We are both male and female at conception until the end of the embryonic period. So again, if anyone tells you you're male or female at birth, or politicians are trying to pass laws about that, remember, they need to study the science a little bit because it doesn't come until a little bit later. All right, now we get into the fetus stage, which is the ninth week until birth. Over here on the right, again, we have the chromosomes that we talked about in the last lecture. It's here on the 23rd pair of chromosomes. That is a male, the X and Y. See the smaller one versus the bigger. And then the X and X for the female. Okay. And then we also went over genetic disorders that can occur on any one of these chromosome levels. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed that assignment. Okay, by 3 months, the fetus weighs 3 ounces and is about 3 inches long. And again, I need to just quote a bunch of this because there's just so many words. And I know you guys have probably covered this before. But again, hormones guide the growth of the body and the brain. Okay, this is also influenced by the environment, food, air, water, drugs, and cosmetics. Um, all right, the hormone most studied is testosterone, which is far more prevalent in the XY fetus than the XX one. And then we also find that, due to this surge of hormones and the XY complications, that maybe males have a little bit more developmental issues than females, but there are specific ones that are assigned to the XX, and, levels of hormones that affect females more. And your book talks about it here. It talks about how the hormones affect the fetal brain. Although differences appear when the average male is compared to the average female, overlap is common. Fewer than 10% of adults are typical for their sex in every one of a dozen traits that distinguish male and female brains. Again, arguing that most brains are a male-female mosaic. Is there really a male brain or a female brain is completely arguable. Yes, we found some differences in hormone levels and a little bit of gray matter in the brain and visual skills versus emotional and social skills, and then a couple of chromosomal differences. But does that really create these drastic differences in behavior, in the way we think, in the way we act? And that's always been a big debate. Whether your your sex determines your behavior, or whether the brain really has no sexes. And that's kind of like the John Locke's blank slate theory. Does the brain have a blank slate, or is there a male or a female brain? This continues to be an unanswered question. As we get further in the fetus stage, the 4-month-old fetus is very active with body movements, and then, they're starting to flex, they're starting to extend, they're starting to move around a little bit, leg kicks, and then, you know, they're moving around in that amniotic fluid, okay? During this rate, this is why a lot of people wait to reveal their pregnancy. The rate of miscarriage really plummets from about 10% from week 5 to 12 to about 2% from weeks 12 on. So once you hit about that fourth week of pregnancy, then you the level of miscarriage really, really reduces. Okay. The heartbeat does speed up for the fetus when it's awake and moving. They begin to digest and eliminate waste. Fingernails, toenails, and buds for teeth form along hair grows, and so do eyelashes. Also, during mid-pregnancy, this is the awakening of the central nervous system. Is this the beginning of a conscious mind? It's something to really think about. And then, but the idea is if a baby is born before 22 weeks, it cannot live. So again, 12 to 20, once you get past 22 weeks, then things are much more viable. So even though the rate of miscarriage plummets from 12 to 20 weeks, still a baby cannot survive until 22 weeks. That's a good thing to take note of. And then in the final 3 months, the most important thing that happens is the growth of the brain, along with the lungs and the heart valves maturing. But by full term, the human growth is so extensive that the cortex has become wrinkled, as we discussed in the beginning. Um, Although some animals have bigger brains, no other creature has as many folds as humans. And as I said, what really separates the human brain is that fold, the ability to just fit more brain cells in there to do more complex stuff. Okay. Beyond brain growth, with an estimated 86 billion brain cells, neurons at birth, an opposite process occurs in the final months of pregnancy, cell death called apoptosis. As many as half of all neurons die. And this is argued why do all these neurons die? Because once the brain is kind of formed, it just kind of sheds the waste. You know what I mean? Like it's decided that it's not going to use these neurons, or those are in a place that's not going to be connected to something else. It's just like you built a highway and then you built an interstate, and now that highway is not as good. You're going to use the interstate, so eventually you just kind of have to cut up that highway. You could argue it's like a pruning process, okay? Abnormal and immature neurons, such as those with missing or extra chromosomes, are also lost. Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. That's pretty good. At birth, 90% of the US births are full term, defined as between 2 weeks before or 1 week after the due date, which is 38 weeks after conception. Okay, usually the fetal brain signals a massive increase in the hormone oxytocin to start labor. So this tells me that it is the baby telling the mom it's ready, which is interesting. A lack of oxygen is called anoxia. This does occur during contractions, and it does slow the fetal heart rate. And then we apply the APGAR scale out of 5 signs to determine the viability of the child, including color, heart rate, cry, muscle tone, and breathing, and to, figure out if anything is wrong. We always need to be aware of teratogens, and this is always on rinse and repeat. You've been getting this since early, intro to psychology. But again, drugs, viruses, pollutants, malnutrition, stress, and more increase the risk of prenatal anomalies and birth complications. Although the first 8 weeks are sometimes called the critical period, that is not quite accurate because every period of pregnancy is the critical period in some way, depending upon what you're exposed to. Albeit the rate of miscarriage greatly goes down. Exposure to teratogens that could happen over across any time in the pregnancy, whether it's from food, drink, and the environment, drug use, whatever it might be, things to think about. Lack of food. Okay. Innate vulnerability, although the precise link genes, teratogens, damage are difficult to verify. Two examples of genetic susceptibility are proven. Again, as I've said, more XY fetuses are aborted than XX fetuses. And again, to explain why that we lose more boys than girls, from my research, the extra steps to make a boy tend to cause complications. Like, why do boys have more rates of autism than girls, for example? And when you guys go to study those kinds of questions, you'll have to look into it. How much of that's genetically influenced, how much is learned, and then how much is just, risk-taking behavior or whatever it might be. But these are things to think about. Why do women live longer than men if put in a place where they have health care and, somebody to help them have babies? Because again, it's lack of health care and babies that are really detrimental to females. And you could argue that females have estrogen, which is good for the heart, and the more levels of estrogen makes it better for their heart, and maybe that's why they live longer. But the main male-female hazard differs from one teratogens to another. Sometimes female fetuses can be more vulnerable, but there's no doubt that genes on the sex chromosomes may increase the power of teratogens. Like if males are exposed to certain different things compared to females? Is it more risky from them? And then second, one maternal allele reduces folic acid, and that deficit can produce a neural tube malformations, either spina bifida, in which the tail of the spine is not enclosed properly. Enclosure typically occurs about week 7, or anencephaly when part of the brain is missing. And this is why we've really, since we've learned about this, pushed things like the need for folic acid and the need for mothers to take vitamins when pregnant to reduce these kinds of problems. Neural tube malformations are more common in certain ethnic groups, Irish, English, and Egyptian, and they argue it could be because this specific type of allele or this specific, is, more prevalent in these populations. And then when it comes to reflexes, it's always debatable whether babies are born with reflexes. But do we suckle and do we, reach out? Do we cry? Are these reflexes? Are these innate behaviors? But you have the Babinski reflex when a newborn's feet are stroked, the toes fan upwards. Stepping reflex, newborns are held upright, feet touching a flat surface, they move their legs as if to walk. Swimming reflex, when held horizontally on their stomachs, newborns stretch out their arms and legs. The palmar grasping reflex, when something touches newborn's palm, they grip it tightly. Moro reflex, when someone bangs on the table they are lying on, newborns fling their arms outward and then bring them together on their chest, crying with wide open eyes. And again, these are pretty cool. All right, but reflexes such as shivering. Do babies, when they're cold, do they cry, shiver, and tuck their legs to cool their bodies? When they're hot, they try to push away blankets and then stay still. Are these reflexes? Okay. Just things to be asking. The suckling reflexes cause newborns to suck anything that touches their lips. So if you touch a baby's lips, does it automatically create the suckling reflex? The rooting reflex, when babies turn their mouths towards something that brushes against their cheek, a reflexive search for a nipple and start to suck. Swallowing also aids feeding, as does crying when the stomach is empty and spitting up when too much is swallowed quickly. And again, are these reflexes, learned behaviors, and I just remember my first intro to psychology class, they were arguing that there are no reflexes. All of this is learned, but again, how much of behavior in humans are determined. When it comes to the parents, hormones trigger labor and birth and then drop in the next few days. That's one reason for postpartum depression. It's suggested that 5 to 27% of women suffer from postpartum depression, but many studies have suggested that breastfeeding can reduce depression, and it could be through the bonding experiences, the oxytocin that is released, the dopamine that's released through breastfeeding, can both help the mother and the baby. So these are things to be thinking about. But again, this is always a lot when we start to delve into developmental psychology. You get introduced to genetics, you start having to delve into biology, you start asking big questions like how do genetics influence disorders and behavior and the way you think and the way you act later in life? Are there gender differences between males and females? How much that's biological in nature, how much of that's learned, environmentally structured, socialized by agents of socialization? So again, we're starting to ask the big questions. But we do have to always delve into quite a bit of biology to really understand what's going on. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Got a quick overview of conception to birth.